Put it lower. Hi, I'm Delia Furtado. I'm from the University of Connecticut. This is joint work with my graduate student, Haiyang Kang, who's been very busy putting up, running new regressions, new results to show you today. So the question that we're asking in this paper is, how do low-skilled immigrants respond to the loss of job opportunities in the manufacturing sector? And specifically, do they respond by making improvements in their English-speaking proficiency? This is the US, and so English is what's especially important. Okay, so why is this question important? I don't need to show you a graph. You probably know this already. There has been major decreases in the availability of jobs within the manufacturing sector in the United States, surely in Canada as well. If you had a look at the paper that is on the website, the paper on the website simply looks at whether cities or local areas that had bigger losses in manufacturing jobs, did the immigrants in those places learn more English in response to this loss of manufacturing jobs? It turns out, however, that a good chunk of the decrease in manufacturing jobs is actually a result of an increase in competition from Chinese imports. And so the results I'm going to be talking about today really look at the impact of manufacturing job loss resulting specifically from competition from Chinese imports. Okay, so there's a large literature considering the horrible consequences, really, of the loss of manufacturing jobs from competition from Chinese imports. Here are a few papers that find that places that have more manufacturing loss because of this Chinese import competition, the people in those areas have higher unemployment rates, lower labor force participation rates, lower wages. They receive more transfer payments like unemployment insurance and disability insurance. They have worse health, higher mortality, more crime. I stopped because it would just fill up the page and you wouldn't be able to read it. But there's lots of bad things that come to the people that lose their jobs when there are no more manufacturing jobs for them. The low-skilled immigrants may be at a particular disadvantage when there are fewer manufacturing jobs for them. Given the repetitive nature of many of these jobs, understanding instructions from managers may be less important. The people that work in production, they don't need to communicate with customers as much, and so little on-the-job communication is probably important. And given that a lot of these are routine jobs, then communication with coworkers is also less important. We know there's lots of evidence that things get better. Wages increase in general as immigrants become more fluent in the host country's language. However, the rate at which their wages increase surely depends on the type of job that they're doing. So for example, in a study looking at Soviet immigrants in Israel, improved Hebrew proficiency absolutely increases the wages of programmers and technicians, but there's virtually no impact of improved Hebrew speaking ability on the wages of construction workers and gas station attendants. Okay, so how might these immigrants respond to the loss of manufacturing jobs? One response would be to learn English. And there's lots of ways that this might happen. It could be that when people lose their jobs in manufacturing, or maybe just before they actually lose these jobs, they may make active investments in learning the host country language. They may take classes, they may start watching movies in English as opposed to watching the Spanish language telenovelas, which they may actually prefer. But it doesn't have to be just about these active investments in language study. It could be that when immigrants lose their jobs in manufacturing, they look around for new jobs. Those who speak a bit of English, they may get jobs in the service sector, and these jobs are the ones that seem to be increasing. And then as they are working with their customers, and they're speaking with their customers, they may learn English on the job. Again, either with active improvements or just with more practice speaking the language. Also, it could be that the people who are not directly affected themselves in terms of these manufacturing job losses, these import shocks are affecting people in entire cities. And so with more people losing their jobs, making active investments, they're speaking with their friends and family members, and so their friends and family members may improve their English-speaking abilities as well. Another possible response, it could be that the immigrants who don't speak excellent English and happen to be in cities or local areas where they lose a lot of their jobs, they may simply move to areas that didn't suffer as much manufacturing loss. This is not necessarily bad news. There's evidence in a paper published in 2016 that low-skilled Mexican immigrants, their location choices are more sensitive to the availability of jobs in different areas. They're a lot more sensitive in terms of where they live than low-skilled natives are. This is good for the local natives, the low-skilled natives who don't necessarily have to move themselves because the immigrants are equalizing economic conditions in different areas. So this is absolutely interesting if people are making these types of changes for the world. It's interesting and important for the world. It's a problem for researchers because if we see that in areas that are hardest hit with the loss of manufacturing, if we see that the immigrants in those areas have better English-speaking abilities, it may be because they learn more English. It could also be that nobody learns more English, but that the ones that really don't speak English very well, they simply leave these areas. I will not, unfortunately, be able to perfectly distinguish these, but as a first step, let's just see what happens. Let's just see if places with more manufacturing loss, the immigrants, the low-skilled immigrants in these areas, on average, do we see improvements in English-speaking abilities? It may be that there are no responses in English-speaking abilities at all, and then we don't have to worry about the reasons for this. So let's look. Okay, so ideally, we would want to put people in different areas and hit some of them with lots of manufacturing jobs and maybe give more manufacturing jobs to people in other areas and then see what happens to their English-speaking abilities. It's hard to do this in practice. What has happened, though, is that there's been major changes in China. We know about all these changes. There's been a transition to a market-oriented economy, lots of rural to urban migration in China. Chinese have gained access to foreign technologies. Multinational companies have been allowed to produce their products in China. And probably most importantly, China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. So these are things that happened in China that are not directly a result of any changes that are happening in the United States. However, these major changes in China absolutely have big impacts on the number of manufacturing jobs in the United States. Most importantly for our purposes, there is variation across different areas in the United States in their exposure to these big supply shocks that are coming from China. And so to look at these Chinese import exposure, I follow the literature and use the exact same measure that has been used in all those other studies that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. The major, hold on, there we go. The major variable of interest here is this change in the number of imports that are coming from China to the United States in specific industries by year. So this measures the number of imports from China to the US, U for the US, in industry J in year T, and I'm dividing this by the number of people that work in a specific city in a specific year. Okay, so there's variation across this variable in different industries. In some industries, there's a lot of imports coming from China, and in other industries, we don't see as many imports coming from China. It turns out, however, that different cities in the United States are specializing in different types of industries. And so, for example, in one area, they may have many factories producing textiles. It happens that a lot of imports come in textiles. And so the cities that were making textiles are going to suffer a lot of manufacturing loss. On the other hand, other cities without many factories, without many manufacturing jobs, they're not going to be as affected. But even those with equal numbers of manufacturing jobs, those that are producing things that China does not produce, will not be as negatively impacted by this competition from Chinese imports. And so this is the basic idea. There's variation across about 400 different industries at pretty specific levels. And then we're predicting how hard hit different cities are by these Chinese imports, depending on what they were producing before these imports came in. Just to give you an idea of where the variation is coming from, I grew up and currently live in Providence, and you can see that that was particularly hard hit by these Chinese imports. If you look at where I work in Connecticut, not so hard hit. People working in the service sector in Las Vegas, they're not going to suffer as much from these losses in manufacturing jobs. And so this is the variation that I will be exploiting. Okay, I use data from the 1990-2000 5% US Census, as well as the 2006 to 2008 American Community Survey. This is easily downloaded from the IPUM's website, and I use that import exposure measure that was used in that original paper by Outer, Dorn, and Hansen. David Dorn has the data on his website. In terms of my sample of interest, it's the working age immigrants, age 18 to 65, from non-English speaking countries who arrived in the United States as adults. They probably didn't come with very excellent English speaking skills, and they're low skilled. They have no more than a high school degree. I exploit variation across 716 commuting zones. Commuting zones, you can think about them as cities. It's just that every location in the United States can be put into a commuting zone based on their commuting patterns, even those in rural areas. Okay, so the benchmark model. On the left-hand side, I have change in English-speaking ability. I specifically use a self-reported variable, how well do you speak English? And people can choose not at all, well, very well. And the outcome I'm looking at is the proportion of these low-skilled immigrants that speak very well in commuting zone I between years T and T+1. And so I have data from 1990, 2000, and then 2006, 2008. And these are differences. So I'm looking within a city at the difference in the share that speak English well between 1990 and 2000. And also I have data between 2000 and 2007. That's the left-hand side variable. On the right-hand side, I have this change in exposure to imports from China. In terms of the control variables, I have some that are specific to my low-skilled immigrant sample. These are share with a high school degree as opposed to less than high school, average age, average years in the US. I also have the same controls that were used in that original Outer study, like the percentage of college-educated population in the commuting zone, as well as the percentage of employment among women. Okay, so looking at the baseline results, in this first column, I have just the controls that were specific to my low-skilled immigrant sample, as well as the year fixed effects. And we see that indeed, in places that were hardest hit by Chinese import competition, in those places, the immigrants, the low-skilled immigrants, had better became better, or a greater proportion of them spoke English very well. In the second column, I add the fixed effects for the 9 census divisions, and in the third column, I add more of those commuting zone level controls, and the estimate remains positive and statistically significant. They're positive, they're statistically significant, but they're probably lower bounds of the true impact. Remember that this is looking at the likelihood that people in certain areas were going to be hit by competition from China because of the industries in those areas, what the factories were producing in those areas. But imagine, for example, that there's a big demand in the United States, or around the world even, actually, but more importantly in the United States, for textiles. Then the places that are producing textiles are going to have more manufacturing jobs. At the same time, we're going to be getting more imports from China in textiles. And so things won't be so bad in those areas that are hardest hit by Chinese competition, because on the other hand, they're responding to an increase in the demand for the products that they're producing. So we'd love to see what's actually happening as a result of the actual Chinese imports. And to do this, we simply substitute that variable imports from China to the United States with imports from China to other rich countries. The other rich countries are Australia, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Japan, New Zealand, Spain, and Switzerland. And so these countries, the imports to these countries, are going to be affected by structural changes in China, and they may not be as affected by the demand for the products specifically in the United States. And when we do this as expected, the first column just shows the first stages of the estimate. The second column shows the second stage. The estimates get actually a bit bigger. Okay, so in terms of interpretation, a $1,000 per worker increase in import exposure over a decade increases the share of low-skilled immigrants speaking English very well by 0.5 percentage point. In terms of a comparison, this is similar to the effect that the original paper found on manufacturing employment per working age population. Other preliminary results, there's evidence that this is causal. We can do some placebo regressions looking at the impact of future import competition from China on the previous decade's English-speaking abilities, and we don't see anything. I can tell you that results seem to be stronger for those with a high school degree. Maybe those are the ones that are more likely to be able to improve their English, or it could be that they're also the more likely to move. No impact on those with college degrees or more, of course, because they're not working in these manufacturing jobs. Stronger results for whites than Hispanics. Okay, step 2 is, do these improvements in average English-speaking ability in certain cities, are they a result of people learning to speak English, or is it just that the people who don't speak English very well, do they move out of the cities that are hardest hit? I don't have a perfect answer to this, and I'd love to talk to you about ways to get at this. For now, all that I've done, or all that we've done, is to look, if people are actually moving, then characteristics of people that cannot be changed, for example, their age or their race, if people are not moving, these characteristics should not change. If people are moving, then we might expect changes in these characteristics. Okay, so in these sets of regressions, I don't include controls for the specific population. If I want to see if they're becoming, if there's a change in the likelihood that they have a high school degree, then I can't control for the share that has a high school degree. So in these specifications, I just have the original commuting zone level variables that were used in the Outer, Dorn, and Hansen paper. And so in that first column, I just redo my analysis with just those controls, and we still have a positive and statistically significant impact on changes in their ability to speak English, as expected. In the last four columns, I look at characteristics that are harder to change, especially after you turn 18. There's no impact on the likelihood that these people have high school degrees. There's no impact on the average age of these low-skilled immigrants in the commuting zones that were hardest hit by Chinese import competition. No impact on the share Hispanic, no impact on the share white. So it seems to me that the populations aren't changing, people aren't moving, it's perhaps that they're speaking better English. Another preliminary results that I just received yesterday. If we split the sample between people who have moved in the recent past, 5 years or 1 year, and the people who have not moved, if all of our results were driven by movers, then we should see stronger results in the sample of people who have recently moved. If, on the other hand, people are responding to the loss of manufacturing jobs by learning English, then we should see stronger results on the population that has not moved in the recent past, since they've been affected by these changes, and that's exactly what we see. So, conclusions. There have been improvements in English-speaking ability among the low-skilled immigrants in those local areas that were more exposed to Chinese import competition. It could be that the immigrants are actively seeking to learn English in order to get those better jobs, the service sector jobs. Maybe they're just passively learning English as others. They're passively learning English on the job, or they're just learning English in response to the changes in English-speaking abilities of their friends and family members. Could also be that good English speakers are likely to stay, bad English speakers are likely to move, but I have preliminary evidence that it's not just about moving. Either way, whether immigrants are responding by moving or improving their English-speaking abilities, I will say that despite the horrible impacts of Chinese import competition among Americans in general, things would have been much worse if the immigrants weren't responding to these changes, either by going into different sectors, which is only possible if they learn English, or by moving to different areas. Next steps is perhaps use Google Trends data to see if people are searching for English classes. I'd love to have panel data where we can actually follow people over time and see if they are becoming more proficient in English. Maybe I'll learn more about available Canadian data during these 2 days.
Thank you, Delia.
Thank you.